Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for the first conversation in the ARTxSCIENCE series. My name is Paul Roach, and I'm the Director of Advancement and Communications here at the American Museum of Ceramic Art. I also want to extend greetings from the museum's Executive Director, Beth Ann Gerstein, who, very appropriately for today's conversation, received her second vaccine shot and is unable to join us. Beth Ann is a firm believer that museums are at their best when they are grounded in their communities. And I'm grateful to the museum's board of directors, donors, and members for making the space for conversations like tonight's possible. We are particularly grateful for special support from Raleigh Marcus, Mark Walsh, and the Do Foundation for making tonight's conversation possible. ARTxSCIENCE features creative, highly accomplished individuals from a wide range of backgrounds who are well equipped to discuss the pressing issues of the day. It is my privilege and honor to introduce our host for the series, Dr. Andrew Vosko, an Associate Provost and Director of the Transdisciplinary Studies Program at Claremont Graduate University, where it's his job to bring together extraordinary and accomplished people from around the world to tackle some of the world's most vexing and complex problems, including environmental sustainability, wealth inequality, and social justice, just to name a few. Dr. Vosko earned his Bachelor of Science from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, with a dual concentration in Japanese language and literature, and biopsychology and cognitive science, and a PhD in neuroscience from the University of California, Los Angeles, in our own backyard, where he trained in the Laboratory of Circadian and Sleep Medicine, the Laboratory of Neuroendocrinology, and the Intellectual and Development Disabilities Research Center. Dr. Vosko, I want to thank you so much for joining us here tonight, and I know I speak for everyone in the audience when I say I'm looking forward to the conversation you're going to craft for us here. Thank you for hosting tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Paul. It's my pleasure. And I'd also like to echo that and welcome everyone to ARTxSCIENCE. It's a conversation series featuring creative, highly accomplished individuals from a wide range of backgrounds who are well equipped to discuss pressing issues and events right now. Today's event, Recovering the Future, features two prominent members of our community, Ellen Reid and Grunfeld, to share the intersection of art and science, and how this intersection, or these intersections, help inform the human experience and how we acknowledge our present and integrate what we know and move forward with our next steps. I'd first like to introduce Ellen Reid, a composer and sound artist whose breadth of work spans opera, sound design, film scoring, ensemble, and choral writing, and she was awarded the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in Music for her opera Prism. You may recently have been familiar with Ellen's work with the LA Soundwalk or that in Central Park. Along with composer Missy Mazzoli, Ellen co-founded the Luna Composition Lab. The Luna Lab is a mentorship program for young self-identified female, non-binary, and gender non-conforming composers. Since the fall of 2019, she has served as creative advisor and composer in residence for the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. Ellen received her BFA from Columbia College, Columbia University, and her MA from CalArts. She is inspired by music from all over the globe, and she splits her time between her two favorite cities, LA and New York. Her music is released on Decca Gold. I also get to introduce Grunfeld, an internationally recognized scientist and physician known for his work on AIDS during the height of the pandemic in the 80s and 90s. His research lab was instrumental in developing the modern understanding of AIDS wasting, and he showed that wasting itself was not terminal and developed therapies to slow or reverse this process. Working with men his age and younger who had been healthy but were now ill had profound effects on Carl. Grunfeld obtained an MD and a PhD from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He did his medical residency at Mass Gen and a fellowship in endocrinology at the National Institutes of Health. He is professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, and associate chief of staff for research and development at the San Francisco Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Wow, there was a lot to introduce there. Welcome to both of our guests. How are you doing this evening? Oh, I think we're on mute. I think that was really going to happen.
Yes, it's such an honor to be here. Thank you. I can't wait to have this conversation.
Thanks for joining us, Ellen. How about you, Carl?
Thank you for inviting us. I hope it'll be fun together.
I am confident it will be, and I think we have a large audience that is excited to hear what you have to say in the conversation we're about to have. And so what I wanted to do to kick this off was to get a sense of, in your own lives, the idea of an intersection, or maybe not an intersection, of how science and art have been a part of it. And I like to think that behind every scientist is an artist and every artist is a scientist. So I was curious, Ellen, to start with, behind your artist identity, is there a scientist, or was there never a scientist, and what kind of relationship do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a lot of ways, music is very scientific. It's physics. You have to think about how things resonate, how it's going to resonate in different spaces, how frequencies interact and create other frequencies. So it's this intuitive physics that you're doing all the time in your head if you're orchestrating. You know, also the scientific method and experimentation is not like strictly, but definitely part of the creative process. We have workshops and we try things out. And, you know, I think that this vigorous experimentalism that you find in the science, you also find in art making. But I don't think about science as part of my process. It's more that is woven in those more intuitive ways.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. And Carl, I have the same question for you, but maybe the converse.
So scientists are interested in creating things. They're interested in discovering new things and presenting it to the world as it accomplished. So we're always open to all forms of creativity. And there are times when we look at the results of our experiment and we say, that's beautiful, that's thrilling, that's exciting. Well, those are the same words you use when you see or hear good art. It's beautiful. It means a lot to me. It's exciting. It stimulates me. So I think the overlap is very strong. And I'll point out that many artists have many scientists have side interests in art because we admire other people who are creative.
Dare I ask if you have a side interest in art, Carl? Which one it might be?
Well, if you look behind me, you can see some photographs. Most of it wildlife. But for instance, to relate to art and music and photography, above my desk is Arnold Newman's picture of Stravinsky at his piano. And he is not just posing, he's obviously in thought as he poses. So that piece of art is my inspiration as I try to think about things.
Okay, so you mentioned two very interesting things that I kind of want to go back to and circle to Ellen and you, the ideas of beauty and inspiration as a part of both of those processes, that it's not necessarily specific to one or the other, but we tend to put beauty and inspiration in the artistic camp, but it's certainly a part of the scientific camp as well. Ellen, how did you develop a relationship with beauty and inspiration over your artistic career? And has it spanned past artistic career and just your own experience as a living, breathing human being?
Wow, that's a lot to think about. Yeah, I mean, beauty, this is a Rilke, if I can remember it, something like beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror that doesn't destroy us. And my relationship with, I think rather than beauty, I think about power. And if something's powerful, or versus being beautiful, because to me, beauty has a certain aesthetic component that maybe isn't functional for, or is maybe limiting with as far as music goes. But a question of power, like beauty can be powerful and so can dissonance, and dissonance can be beautiful. You know, so I think about those things. And similarly, I think about that as I process, you know, challenging or exciting things in my life as a person. Like the intensity is something I think about versus the more than the quality. Like sometimes, I know we'll get into this more, but like an intensely positive experience can be almost as traumatic as an intensely negative one.
Okay, there's a lot there. I want to go back, and the quote that someone in the chat had actually added is, "Beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror that doesn't destroy us." I think that's really profound. Yeah. Carl, you're in an interesting position where you're a scientist and you're a clinician too. And you've dealt with spaces that, when we look from the outside, seem like there's a lot of terror in them. If you're dealing with really serious topics, and certainly this last year, that's not an exception, that was probably the norm. Were you able to see beauty in those spaces, or you're hoping that you're going to get to a point where you feel comfortable enough that you can look back and say, yes, there was beauty there?
Well, all of the above. But let me move us back to AIDS.
Okay.
So when I started, it was AIDS. We didn't even know what HIV was. We didn't know what CD4 cells were and how the immunosuppression worked. And people were frightened that we would all get infected. So stepping in was full of terror. And then you watched these very young people wasting away and dying. And then all of a sudden, the pieces got put together by the scientists, the therapies began to roll out, and you realized that people were getting better. And that's terror and beauty in the opposite direction, but nevertheless part of how we approach it. Therefore, as I began to get involved in COVID policy and thinking about this new thing that we hardly knew about, I began to look back at the previous terror and was just a little bit better able to handle it and advise people. So don't underestimate the terror. You do take it home at night, but you learn a lot. And I learned a lot from the patients in the AIDS era that I hope is transferred to my patients and staff now.
Ellen, you had mentioned something about trauma, that it could come from something positive as well as something negative. Can you explain that a little bit more? Because I think it sounds like a really rich statement. I'm not sure I have the experience to comprehend that fully, though.
So for example, when I got the Pulitzer Award, it was something that was out of my realm of reality, kind of. I mean, I guess it wasn't, but it felt like it was. And then from that point forward, I was in some ways in my field a different person, because people have put so much weight on certain things like that. So that kind of that, and all of a sudden, I mean, the arts, I guess, I don't know if this is this way in the sciences, I'm curious, arts is so much just about what people's opinions. And so then some people who were like, we don't know what that girl's doing, all of a sudden they were like, we want you to write all this music for us. So I had this like kind of overnight massive amount of attention. Like every person I've known in my life was texting me, and it was all great. It was all light. There was no shadow. But like when there's more light, there is more shadow. And that change was a positive trauma. And I can say that, like, I think a trauma of like, if you lose someone who's close to you, your life, there is a before and an after. And with an experience that's a positive trauma, there's also a before and an after. Or like meeting the person I'm married to, it changes your life in a profound way, where in some way you have to leave the person you were before and manage all the things that does to your body.
Okay, I do understand what you're saying. And that is a really new way for me to look at it. I appreciate that a lot. And Carl, I'm curious what your concepts of trauma are, and if you've ever thought of it in this way, of there's different kinds of, as you said, lights and shadows that are both impactful in either way in defining trauma for your own experience or for others.
Well, I've mentioned one trauma, which was the AIDS epidemic, which was just devastating to our city and particularly to the arts community, my friends, my colleagues. That is longer lasting. What I probably haven't revealed is that as I was doing that work on AIDS wasting, my first wife developed brain cancer. And my life revolved around her in many senses, as did most of our family. So at the very time that your career has gone into the positive mode that Ellen has talked about, and you're very excited, all of a sudden you're yanked back into the reality that we are all mortal and that we are going to lose someone that we love. What I will say is I learned from my patients how better to deal with my wife's illness and the thereafter.
So I'm getting a sense that there's something transformative in trauma. Is that true for both of you? Carl, was there something transformative in there?
Yes, I do think I approach patients, family, and friends differently. I do think I appreciate aspects of life more. But I want to say one of the questions that people raise is about healing. And I actually don't like that word when it comes to trauma, because it makes people think, oh, if you do X, you'll get over it. What people have to understand is that you don't get over a trauma. A trauma is a trauma. You move into a different sphere, which is exactly what Ellen said. And that's important to understand so that you don't make mistakes in advising other people. And you begin to understand what is going to happen with the trauma of COVID in terms of death of friends and family, loss of job, loss of future plans, loss of sense of safety and security. It has long-lasting effects for generations.
And Ellen, yeah, I'm curious on your perspective here.
Yeah, I think everything, all that. I prefer rather than transformative, because I think that transformative, whether or not you mean it, one means it this way, it has a like positive quality where like to transform is toward a better. I prefer the language around trauma of it being dormant or active. And so that it's there. And day to day, it's either dormant or active. And that kind of elliptical, or like that movement of that language feels more appropriate to me.
So as we're talking about trauma, it makes me think that there are a lot of ways that we work through and with trauma. And one of the cruel realities of our time now is that a lot of our working with trauma is done in absentia of a community or of others. And I know, Ellen, you composed an opera about trauma. Was that something you were able to do on your own? Or was that something that was a community project, that was something that involved working with it, with a lot of other people? And stop me if I'm misinterpreting the creation of Prism, but I had that sense, and I wanted to hear what that's like, and how would that compare if you were to do it right now?
Yeah, I mean, making an opera is both collaborative and deeply not collaborative. You know, everybody's kind of the king of their own kingdom. And Roxy Perkins, who is a librettist, you know, she was, you know, like at the helm of the text, and James Dara was at the helm of the visuals. But the composer is the person who kind of sews it all together. So I would have really these like deep and exploratory conversations with Roxy about how we could bring these different elements into the opera. And then I had to sit with the story and go there myself and bring out the music that would resonate in those spaces. So in some ways I was certainly in community, and in some ways I was totally by myself in that.
And Carl, in the way that you saw people experiencing their own traumas throughout a clinical space, but also your own personal experience there, how has that relationship between individual and community played out in the past, and how have you seen it playing out now?
Well, you can do nothing as an individual. You really need nothing in my career has ever been done on my own. And even my advancing personally, 9 years after my wife died, I met another wonderful woman. I've remarried. I have a wonderful family. And everyone said it gave me back my smile. Now, that doesn't mean the trauma isn't there. You can hear it in my voice. When you're dealing with dozens of young men who are dying of AIDS, you need the whole community of caregivers, physicians, nurses, even pharmacists and dietitians that you don't think of the community, to get together and build a process for those people to do well, or at least to do better than they would have done alone. None of this can be done alone. It has to be done with community. And one of the terrible things about COVID is we're all in these little windows on the screens in Zoom, and we're missing that personal contact that amplifies what we do together. You know, I don't like to talk about, as a scientist, energy between people, but the bottom line is when you're in the room with someone, there's an energy.
I think that's a good segue, because you're both still working and you're doing it in a space that's not being, maybe sometimes it's in the same room with whatever protocols are there. But a lot of it, I'm assuming, is in a more individualized, isolated way. What does it feel like from a before and after, or a before and now, in your own creativity, in your own satisfaction, in your own wanting to get up and go to work in the morning? What does it feel like when you're going to work in the morning is maybe a screen with two very amazing people that you're speaking with, but it isn't actually sitting in the same physical space as them? Go for it. Yeah.
I don't know if I guess I'll start. So I just feel like this year has felt like 7. And so you ask, like, how is it to get up and go to work? And it's like, well, every day feels like a super different day. I think that we're up because we're not having this regular meeting. We're up against the backdrop of whatever is happening in the news cycle and in the cities where we are, and that it's been really too much to process this year. And I think we'll continue to process what this year has been for a while. Yesterday, I was at a recording studio with a singer who I really love to work with. She's amazingly talented, and she's a friend, and I haven't seen her in a year. And I saw her, and I had this feeling of like, I don't really know you right now. I don't know you anymore, because we've both had these 2 different experiences through the past year, and every person has had these unique traumas, these unique journeys that I think we're going to have to re-meet each other after this year, and that's going to be a lot. So
that is interesting. I've noticed in myself that I'm weird when I'm around people now. I am not the same person I thought I used to be.
Yeah. How does that come up for you?
For me, I'm awkward, and I've come to be comfortable talking to people through a screen in ways that I never thought I could. I used to be an awkward silence kind of person, and in a screen, and now whatever world I've created inside my own mind has allowed me to pretend that is a new normal, and I hate that term, but that's what I've gotten used to. Carl, you have an additional responsibility in your job, in that you're the Associate Chief of Staff for Research and Development at the hospital. So are you making administrative decisions on how other people are able to interact with each other as part of the scientific process, or is that something that other people do outside of you?
Oh my, administrative decision after administrative decision after administrative decision, which of course is not what many of us signed up to do. We signed up to be creative and build programs. And sometimes the administration outweighs the science. And my reaction has been to become very impatient, if not angry. So I'm working on that. issue. But on the other hand, I can on occasion sit back and look at what my colleagues have done, what we've done together, and see the creativity within how we're approaching what we're doing now. Not what we had planned, but the same creativity that went into building groups to do research, building experiments and designs go into how do we rearrange the hospital? How do we get high throughput vaccine and testing of stuff we'd never done before? So it's part invigorating and part infuriating.
So this is interesting though, because often we don't think of creativity in the scientific process this way, but you're making me stop and think for a second that there's a tremendous amount of creativity that's gone into, certainly on the vaccine creation and distribution side of the house. I mean, this is something that is, when you think about it, an entire nation being vaccinated in a number of months, or seeing other nations in the world being vaccinated almost completely in a number of months, it's profound that you can change people, and you're actually changing our bodies, all of us, at the same time across the world.
Yeah. Dare I admit it, there's the creativity in these vaccines, which is spectacular, but we actually obviously need creativity in how to administer them, which means we need administration creativity, something you really rarely associate together, the word creativity and administration.
As an administrator myself, I appreciate that a lot, Carl. I'm going to use that next time in a meeting when people say, oh, the administration. Like, wait a minute, soundbite, Carl. We are creative people just like you. Ellen, how has creativity looked in unexpected ways for you as a sound artist or as somebody in music that is used to doing things some ways, but creativity is like a big C creativity, like this idea that, oh, you've created a magnum opus, but you've seen it in a bunch of ways. What have they looked like?
You mean during how have I seen creativity during the pandemic?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that that artists have the same like torrent of creativity that they want to express, and that all of the normal ways of expressing those are closed. And so people are finding new ways to express what they have to express. We were talking about this right before everybody joined on, but a lot of fabulous musicians who didn't know how to use a computer really have become recording engineers during this period of time, because that was the way that they could collaborate and make their voices heard. I know people who have like branched into kind of side branches of their normal creative pursuits. And I think everybody is doing a lot of deep thinking at the same time about like, what does this mean? How am I interacting in the creative world? We all have time to process things in a more intense way right now, almost like too much time to process things. Yeah. I would also say, just on another level, if listening is creative, I've found that I have more time to listen to things, and that I'm actually enjoying listening to music more than before the pandemic.
Has your listening changed also, Carl?
We have made an effort to listen to new music, download new things, and actively go through certain repertoires. And that's been quite wonderful. On the other hand, I really do miss a live concert. We were just talking about that at home recently, and we finally made it into a museum that was open at 25%. And sure, I've enjoyed the fact that the Oakland Museum put all of Dorothea Lange's photographs on the internet and I can go through them. But when my wife and I walk through the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, there's nothing compared to actually being there in the presence, life size, whatever it is, and being able to enjoy it together like that.
Yeah, there is no substitute for the in-person components. But there is, as you said, there's also a lot of creativity that comes around of kind of hybridizing what that could actually be. And so I wonder if in the future, for both sides of the house, so science is a creative process, administration is a creative process, or art making is a creative process. Do you think that we're going to move forward with new technologies that have emerged from this creative process that are going to change the way we might have interactions at maybe a museum, or have art performance, or to have administratively creative acts carried out? Yeah, Ellen, if you don't mind starting with that one.
Sure, I think absolutely. I mean, we are continually evolving. You know, I think that we will see ripples from the intense use of technology and having to like reach out to each other through that. For years into the future, I think that what we're talking about is a much if we take a long view, it will certainly impact things, but it might take a minute for it to synthesize, where we might have these kind of non-functional things going parallel, and then, you know, some child who experienced the pandemic is the person who like brings it together because it's been part of their life from the beginning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a strange social media image I had seen with a toddler going up to something that was kind of rectangular that was in a public park and putting her hands underneath it, thinking it was a hand sanitizer object, because that's what she was used to thinking this kind of thing was. Right. And yeah, when you said like the people who are very young right now are going to look at the world very differently, that really spoke.
Totally. Yeah, one of my friends has a 3-year-old, and she named her 2 new little dog toys Germs and Nightmares.
Oh my gosh. Oh, geez. That's speaking some truth, certainly during certain times, yeah. So Carl, how do you think this is going to change?
So let me go back to the way Ellen said it in the previous question. I'm going to paraphrase, and that is using new forms of creativity to get to ways to express what she had to express. So there are 2 pieces of this, and that is, one is that we as artists and scientists are driven by what we have to do. Okay, and the other is that she's learned new ways to go about doing it. The very process of learning new ways opens you up to other new ways. So I'm not going to predict the future, because as Yogi Berra once said, it hasn't happened yet. But I do believe that the fact that we have had to open up to new ways of doing things will actually have profound effects on our creativity. That has happened throughout my career in science, where all of a sudden someone creates a technique that we had nothing to do with, and we look at it and we say, oh, wait a minute, I can use that for this. I think that's going to happen across the board in science, in the arts, and maybe even in administration.
You know what's interesting about that comment, Carl, is that I think there are mindsets that allow for someone maybe to see that as an opportunity to say, oh, there's a new technique, let me go back. I mean, other people to say there's a new technique, I don't want to know what that is because I'm doing what I do. Do you see this? Do you see that more people are now accepting of the new technique being integrated into their lives, or is it the same as always? You get just a mix of the population where you're either kind of flexible or you're not.
It's a mix.
It's a mix still?
It's a mix. Unfortunately, it's a mix. I think the point is that people who are open are being open to newer things that they hadn't thought about. Some of the people who weren't open are being opened, and some people are regressing psychologically.
And do you see something similar, Ellen?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, especially in classical music, that there are these different camps of new music. Some people only want music that was written a long time ago. So I don't know. I'm curious to hear if people's listening habits and appreciation habits have shifted from, having time to think about things or listen in new ways. But yeah, I agree with Carl, where it's just kind of a churning all the time.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily progress or anything. It's just churning.
Well, okay. So I like those questions that begin with how do other people do it, because it's actually setting it up for you. And if you were to each think about, what are we now, going on 13 months of being in whatever we call this phase that we've been in, and it certainly has gone through different stages. I will say it hasn't been linear. It's not like we've been going up. It's more like this and all over the places. If anything, it's not been predictable. Where within this country, a lot of us thought that our strategy was to be on the side of science is going to be the thing that's going to bring us to a normalization again, going back to what we want. How have you changed internally in the ways your mind thinks about the big changes that are coming, or that we're going toward a future, or that you need to, I'm not gonna say transform because you already corrected me on this, Ellen, but to be moved in some way, maybe 13 months ago, and thinking about it now, today? That was a really long-winded question, I know. But I just wanna kind of get a reflection kind of question, and where you would be with, if you know those things where you write a letter to yourself, looking back, what would that entail? What would be the most important components of that letter if they were about how your character or how your thought process is going to change, if at all?
I just feel like I don't know anything. And I have no idea. And I used to believe in some kind of, like, not believe is a strong word, but I used to trust my intuition more. I would get, I would follow that. And now I have no idea about anything. And so I just feel like a baby.
All right. I understand that very well, actually. I do understand that very well. And Carl, how about you? You had a little time to mull over that.
So I had a trust that science would eventually get us out of this with vaccines and or medicines. And in a sense, that's true, but it's really missed the fact that we could have gotten out of it much earlier if we as human beings had communicated and understood and worked together to help each other. So the thing that was most devastating to me was how individualism, particularly in the United States, made it all worse, leaving us to think about, should things like this happen again, or should other things happen? How do we regain the public trust and the public communication in a way that facts are presented as facts and we band together to help each other? Or is that futile? Are there always going to be people who don't want to help others?
As you're speaking, Carl, it's reminding me of two things. First is that science doesn't exist in a vacuum. You can't just say this magic word science and then something happens after you cast your science spell that takes care of everything. But secondly is that science, I think we kind of align it with something that's new and innovative. Whereas a lot of science for a long time has told us how to deal with pandemics. There's been a lot of data on learning from the past on what do you do epidemiologically when you see something that spreads like this, and how do you keep people from spreading it in these ways? But we were looking toward innovation more than looking at lessons learned from science at the same time.
Yeah.
you are somebody who learned some lessons because you've dealt with more than one kind of, you dealt with an epidemic that you saw and learned a lot from. So if you were to have given some advice to a, let's say, local political leader, not at a national level, but at a local political leader from what you had worked with in the past, and it would have been the beginning of the pandemic, what do you think you would have said?
Oh, a lot of things. But to throw it back into Ellen's domain, it isn't just the facts. It isn't what you say that counts, unfortunately. It's how you say it. So science and politics is a performance art. And you can capture the audience or you can bomb. And I've had both happen to me, where I've got the audience very excited and I've got the audience going, oh. So unfortunately in the United States, how you give the message is crucial. That's one of the things we taught the world because we invented advertising. So my advice would be gather the facts among the best scientists and work with them and the best people to help you express it and try to get the community together.
Okay, Ellen, I have to throw this back at you. In addition, I want to come back to the community question, but as somebody who creates performance artwork, do you see what Carl is speaking about now, that we've seen the performance of how the pandemic has played out with individual responses in a way that is almost operatic, or in a way that is almost audience interaction to create the final product?
Yes, completely, 100%. Yes, thank you, Carl, for framing it so clearly. This is not quite an answer to your question, but just to say that I keep coming back to the fact that if we had all been still for 2 weeks, that would have been it. And it's just so crazy to me that it's that amount of time would have had that much of an impact.
Well, I want to ask about, not to say that you have to speak as a Lorax on behalf of all people in performing arts, but as a performing artist, if you were to go back at the beginning of this time, knowing that lens, if you're going to use that, how do you think you could have given a nugget of wisdom there, or something that really could have helped people understand how to be effective in the science, or what we've learned from science, or just about being human, to have helped this process?
I'm a bit skeptical. Like, I don't think there's a thing. I think that we are more and more living in our own realities. And so we'd have to create a lot of different things to reach people in different realities, because things code differently depending on your community and the community you choose to be in. So I think that America is so big. We have so many different communities and centers of meaning that we'd have to, I think, back to what Carl was saying, like, find the local leaders who understand the depth and the nuances of those communities, the language, the images, and then from there create the material that conveys the act.
So that, okay, really interesting again, in that when you recognize that we're all in our own, we're in a very big place, and each of us has our own world that we occupy in that place. How do you think arts help us break into the world that other people occupy? And I'd like to start with Ellen and then go back to Carl on this.
I have a few answers for this. So one of them is just practical. If you're listening to music, you're listening to something in time, and it brings people in time, into the moment, into a shared collective experience. And we might be experiencing it really differently, but we're having a shared experience, which is something that's kind of challenging to do. I think that the arts can be anything, so it's really broad, but how I try to make my art is that I try to create through it in different ways the world that I want to be in. And, you might wonder, like, how is that possible with a piece like Prism that explores something like sexual assault? And I don't mean that the subject matter is positive. What I mean is that the way that people interact through the creation of the process, and like the fact that a subject like that belongs on the stage, is the world I want to be in.
All right, that is very helpful. And Carl, I'm very curious on your opinion on this too.
So when I first got interested in art, I thought of it merely as beautiful. Then I realized how it made me feel. And then I realized how it made me think. In that context, I believe arts may be more powerful at advancing us in many domains, such as trauma, such as politics, such as the environment, because I can write the best papers in the world and present it scientifically, but it's got to be spread around. And an artist will capture your thinking, even if you're not a scientist, if you're not a politician. Art brings us there. We saw To Kill a Mockingbird on the stage just before everything shut down. And the power of that, having even read the book, was just tremendous. That's what art can do. Art can lead us down the paths we have to go.
These are both really rich responses that have a number of things that number of directions we can go in after this. But before we do, I wanted to invite Paul Roach back to the conversation, who is representing the American Museum of Ceramic Arts and all that it does in Southern California as a museum of the craft art of ceramics. It's not the performing arts space, but it's an art where literally you see the imprint of the artist as a part of your experience with it. And I want to ask Paul a similar question of what do you think in terms of this past year and in the future of what role a museum like AMOCA will have in understanding the different worlds of audiences that we're trying to connect, and how would it possibly help people direct them in the where we want to go or who we want to be?
That's a really good question. I think one of my favorite things about working in the museum world is I am surrounded by people who think deeply and creatively on a daily basis about how we can take the wonderful pieces of art that so often inhabit our buildings' walls, and how do we connect them not only with our community, but with the needs of the community. How does it reflect what our community is going through? How does it reflect who our community is and what they aspire to be? And the pandemic, I think, has really shifted that in very interesting ways. If you had come to me a year ago and said, museums are going to have a really interesting part to play in public health, I would have looked at you and said, okay, convince me. And had you called Carl, he probably could have done it because he's obviously very persuasive and eloquent. But AMOCA is hosting a vaccine drive in our parking lot next week for our community. And that's something that I think never came up in conversation with any of my colleagues in the museum world. How can we play a part in delivering healthcare to the communities that we're embedded in? And I think that, just as an easy example, is a start for how we're starting to reimagine the partners we can be in our communities as museums.
One of the things that I really love about AMOCA is that it introduced me into an art form that was just so very accessible. I don't have the gift of a photographic eye, or you don't want to ask me to paint anything. And actually, you don't want me to throw a pot either. That would be pretty ugly. But because it's something that is based on texture, it's based on this idea that you're feeling and that you can almost feel, and they'll teach you how to feel and understand what somebody else was doing in creating an object to feel. I have a lot of appreciation for the modality and the potential power that it holds. So if you were to explain to somebody who was not into ceramics and you had a place that made it accessible, and they're dealing with the trauma and they're dealing with the not healing, not transformation, but the moving with it, embracing it, moving forward, what kind of things do you think ceramics offer people in that kind of space? And then I want to move this into the other art forms in science with our other guests as well. But first, I wanted to ask Paul that question.
Yeah, and I'm not nearly as erudite as Ellen or Carl, and I think they phrased it beautifully earlier in the same way that I would phrase it for ceramics. Art and creativity are wonderful ways to process who we are and who we aspire to be. As you mentioned, ceramics happens to be working with our hands as a very physical art form. One of the challenges we often find with folks who've been working for clay for many years are the injuries they sustain from sitting at the potter's wheel or for working in clay. And I have no doubt that folks working in music and the performing arts, and also with the long hours in the sciences, will often experience similar things. But certainly working with your hands, I think, helps people process in a way. I think they specifically, when you look at young people, you'll find groups of people we see in our research that respond differently to art that you can create physically with your hands and involves movement, whether that is dance or ceramics or painting where you can get up and move around. I think all of those tend to reach people in a very specific way. And it's one of the things that I think ceramics does very well.
No, that's really helpful. And I love that it's a different modality than what we've been speaking about before, but it does bring its own specific kind of not just coping, but of growing with it. So I feel like Ellen would probably be able to speak to this in terms of music, but whatever art form you're interested, what do you think it uniquely brings to the process of embracing, coping, moving forward? I don't know the correct term exactly.
I just know my experience with music. So I don't feel like I can speak to everybody's experience. And I think each musician is coming at it from a very personal, different place. In my experience, kind of working through, or just thinking specifically about PRISM, having a trauma that I had to kind of exist with and bring other people into, it gave a space to go. It gave like a padding almost to like go deeper than I could go without the music. It allowed me to go deeper into all of the feelings and the physical experiences, the challenges, what it brought up. I was able to sit with those because I had the music to hold it. And also music exists in time, and you are able to bring in the light and the shadow through the music in time. And something about that feels cathartic. I don't know if any of that made any sense.
Yeah, it absolutely did.
It's hard to talk about.
Yeah, no, it absolutely did. Thank you. And Carl, similar question to you.
It's perfectly obvious where science has to go in this, but this is medical research, and I am an MD, PhD. And one of the things that I want to talk about is how we've learned that you can have a technique, but you've got to be able to give it to the people. You have to be able to spread it, and you have to really protect the medical people. Now, fortunately, in San Francisco, we never had a serious surge, and our hospitals weren't overwhelmed. But I have friends who have been in hospitals where the emergency rooms were filled, the ICUs were expanded, and how the staff got together and did that and survived it working hard, yet in the midst figured out new things like proning, allowed people to be less on respirators. I think it's a broader thing than science, and our job is to take what we learn in science and make it broader. That's sort of the way I would not answer your question, but maybe answer your question.
It was a good non-answer to my question, because you actually took what we were talking about and turned it into what to do next. And I think that's really valuable, because the idea of spreading the message is one that's so important. And what you're talking about, even in proning, how many thousands of lives did that impact? With something simple like spreading the idea that it was so important for the recovery of so many people from the coronavirus. And for those that don't know, proning was the lying on your belly, essentially, rather than on your back, because they found that your lungs can expand more in the space when you got limited capacity to do that.
And we treated COVID severe COVID with dexamethasone. We learned about that from pneumocystis chronic pneumonia in AIDS. So there is hope, but we've got to be able to distribute it to people.
I really like that message of distributing hope. And I think that's where I want to end our immediate conversation, and then open it up to the audience who's listening and hear or probably read by typing what they have to say. And so I welcome anybody in the comment section to add a question. And I also have a few to start to get the ball rolling. And the first one I had that I had read from the comment section is, if either of you had to live through this experience again, what, if anything, would you do differently? So, Carl, the sigh means that I need to ask you first, because you've thought about this a bit.
We were very early focused on shutting down and how to rearrange things, and did not enough think about the future, both the immediate future, other than, oh my God, we're going to have a lot of patients coming in, or the long-term future. What's our life going to be like? And I think early on, I would have taken more time to sit and think about the future during the absolute disaster, which is very hard to do, admittedly. But I think it was too much in the back of her mind for too long.
And Ellen, I have a similar question for you here.
So, I think I had, Carl, the exact opposite kind of experience, where I was totally isolated and felt, it sounds like from what I'm getting in the conversation, like there were ways where you could make decisions that impacted people. And it felt like all this stuff was happening, and it just was a very solitary experience where I was really powerless, honestly. I don't know. So I feel like if I did something differently, it wouldn't have the impact of if you did something differently. If I did something differently, it would just be about how I processed for myself this moment, which I don't think I can have done any differently. I just rode those waves and tried to make the most of what I and do what I could, which is kind of all you can ever do.
I think everybody's experiences are so specific to their experiences here that there probably isn't a singular answer that would make sense to anyone, because it's that old adage about everybody like feeling a different part of an elephant. Everybody's experience has been profoundly different, and I think the more stories we can hear of the individuals is when we really start to get the very complicated 3D shape that was this past year, and however many months longer, or if we were to assign a specific window of time to what we've been experiencing. So there was another question that came in the chat, and that was, how do you each think that arts and science will continue to respond in the aftermath of the pandemic? both on how our lives change and the traumas that we have or we will experience collectively? Do you think there is going to be a change? Who would like to go first with that? Okay, I'm going to go with Carl again, just because Ellen had just finished 5 seconds ago.
So, you talked about it being an opera. I think it's closer to a Shakespearean tragedy. And I think that we have to bring that forward and explain to people what it was like. I must also add that it's shown us how fragile things are. And one of the things that's very fragile is the arts. So I really fear that artistic enterprises are going to fold for lack of money. And as a scientist who begs for funding all the time, I will plug in to fund your favorite artists and museums, because that's what's going to inspire us in the future. And we have to support the arts.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you. And Ellen, how about you?
Can you ask me that question again?
I can. So how do you think that the arts and science will continue to respond to the aftermath of the pandemic, and how our lives change, or how we've collectively dealt with traumas?
I don't know, but I'm excited to find out. I think that we're emerging and we're different people. And so it'll be really fascinating and maybe even beautiful to see how we need each other more in the future, and how we can use arts and sciences to evolve will be really fascinating.
I was hoping you were going to bring up the beauty concept as we were at the edge of not knowing, and you did a beautiful 360 there. So we came back around to where we were at the beginning. I have one final question that had come earlier, and that was, someone mentioned that they knew from their own experience that you can't approach the arts without your emotional investment. And they also know you can't really approach science or medicine without emotional investment. Have you seen people try to do this without emotional investment? Does it work at all? And have you seen it in this last year? And probably the more important question is, what role does resilience play in the artistic or the scientific processes, given that there's a lot of emotional investment that's asked of you? So Ellen, I think to round it out, we're going to begin with you here, and then we're going to finish off with handing the baton to Carl.
Yeah, definitely there's a lot of resilience that's needed, and there's a lot of emotional investment. And I've definitely seen some musicians driven by things that weren't their emotional investment. And, at a point, maybe you can hear it, maybe not, I don't know. Yeah, I think that as an artist, I make things because I like to make them. And that is what has to drive me at the end of the day. And the critics and whoever, it's just something else. And I make it because I like to make it. And that if I can stay in that place, then, I think the art is better. And then the world I'm in is, better.
Carl, to round it out. Thank you, Ellen.
I could take what Ellen said and just substitute the words. There's a lot of rejection in science, and if you're going to get beyond it, you have to have the same sort of emotional commitment. And to me, that emotional commitment is what gets you the good science, just like it's what gets you the good art.
All right, so you heard it here first, folks. Everyone needs emotional commitment, be it in the science or the arts, that we need to remember funding for both science and arts as we move forward, that beauty is something that is at the edge of our noses right now because we are on this precipice of not knowing in this potentially terrible but awful but also beautiful at the same time space, and that there are a lot of intersections with arts and sciences. So I want to thank Ellen Reid and Carl Grunfeld for joining us this evening. This was a fantastic conversation, and to thank Amoka for hosting this and bringing us closer to this intersection of art and science. So Paul, thank you for having us in the ARTxSCIENCE space. So we look forward to having more conversations with all of you, and we thank you for being a part of our audience tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vosko. Thank you to everyone joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you back soon for episode number 2. Be sure to stay subscribed to our newsletter for more updates about when that'll be happening coming soon. And thank you again, Carl and Ellen, for a remarkable conversation. And have a good night, everyone.